We had just circumstances that began last night after 10 o'clock that were okay, but just kind of cumulatively have had the impact over the course of the next number of hours. So, but anyways, we're back in Revelation. I'm going to ask you to turn to Revelation 18. And as we come there, there's this is a very interesting section as we follow it through, and we've been taking and as I had said to you, Revelation 18 is in the form of what we might call a doom song. This doom song is toward Mystery Babylon, or Babylon Mysterion. I almost prefer to call it Babylon Mysterion so that we don't think mystery in the sense of the common English use of the word mystery, but rather we think of it in terms of the fact that there is a spiritual truth that God is revealing for us in the course of presenting this image of the seductress, unfaithful woman as compared to the bride that comes down out of heaven, the New Jerusalem. But as we've looked at this doom song, it has various stanzas to it. And so first of all, we heard the song from heaven, and we saw explicitly a pronouncement of what Babylon will look like in its fallen and finally destroyed state. We saw a warning song, and that warning song was given to believers. And as that warning song was given to those who were believers, the warning was to come out of Babylon, to not be caught up in the system and spirit of Babylon Mysterion. And it's written, when you look at it, that it's written in the present tense. And I think that that's a significant thing, that as God gives this vision to John, John speaks in the present tense to the church in that day. And he's speaking in the present tense because the spirit of Babylon Mysterion, this exploitative, corrupt world economic system, is a spirit that goes through all the ages. We may see this final culminating figure at the end of days, or this final culminating system at the end of days, but the reality is this is a spirit, this is a manner of operation that in fact happens through all the centuries, and believers can get sucked into this system or not, and operating inside of this system and accepting the ethic and morality of the system or not. And then what happens is from there we see the song move to the song from earth. And that song from earth is, first of all, the lament of political leaders who are controlled and enriched by this corrupt, exploitative spirit. So they are part of the workings of Babylon Mysterion. And so we talked a little bit about how it is that if you take a look at the kings of the earth, or even in our democratic societies, the voted in leaders of the earth, what happens is, in a lot of ways, they ultimately are ruled by the financial system, by the trade system. We talked about, I made allusion to the fact that there is, I think it's, I'm going to have to go back and think about the numbers, but I think that there is, in the U.S., there's 120 lobbyists for every senator. You consider that. There's 120 different people with all of their financial interests trying to buy the votes of every single senator in Washington. Like, that is incredible. Offering favors, saying that we'll do this for you, offering positions on boards of directors after they get out of their political position, whatever it may be. I mean, all you have to do, a few years back, I remember seeing who sat on the board of directors of Monsanto, and it was incredible seeing Hillary Clinton and people like that on the board of directors of Monsanto. and trying to wrap my head around why it is that a massive agricultural pharmaceutical conglomerate would consider Hillary Clinton and others like her to have the expertise to be making decisions for their company. Well, what was it? It was influence bought. That's what's going on. So when we take a look at this, and when I see this, you understand what's going on as these political leaders are described in chapter 17 as ruled by, as actually under the dominion of Babylon Mysterion. That's a very, very interesting thing to think about this. Ruled by the corrupt, exploitative economic system. Now, and after that, the next thing that we looked at was the lament of the merchants. And these merchants traded in goods and luxuries and human souls, as it says. And they're operating inside of and as allies of the spirit of Babylon Mysterion. Now, the next song we're getting to is the song of the forwarders and logistics people. Now, you think about that. I put it in those terms because of the fact that I think it's important for us to understand how this looks in the world. This is the song of the forwarders and logistics people. Essentially, it's the song of those who can say, well, I'm not really part of it, I'm just carrying the product. But being enriched carrying the product. And as I look at this, it's a reminder regarding what it means to be people who are actually committed to love and benevolence and holiness and doing good and following Christ. A number of years back, when my brother was associate pastor at a church down near Windsor, I remember that what happened was he told me about something that he had to deal with that was extremely frustrating to him. And what was happening was Casino Windsor was opening up. And as Casino Windsor was opening up, of course, his church, being a good, solid evangelical church, was speaking against the opening of the casino. But then the casino project was approved, and it was moving ahead. And suddenly, he found out that one of his deacons got the contract to paint the casino. Well, somebody was going to get the money. Might as well be me. At least I can put some of it in the offering plate. You think about that. So he had to go and he had to talk to him about this. Didn't change the guy's mind. But this is the seduction of Babylon Mysterion. And this is the reality of why it is that the warning is given to believers not to come out of her, to not be seduced by her. And this is why it is we have to take a look at even the song of the forwarders and logistics people and understand that as we're listening to the song of the forwarders and logistics people, I just carry the product, or, well, somebody's going to make the money, doesn't cut it. And it happens all the time inside of church circles. So this is why it's a good thing for us when we take a look at Revelation, not to look at it simply from the perspective of what's out there and what other people are doing and other circumstances. This is why it's important for us as believers to give consideration to whether the ethics and morality of Mammon as God has greater control over us than the moral values of the kingdom. What shapes us? What shapes our thinking? What shapes how we operate as we live in this world? It's an important thing for us to give consideration to this. And so here's what the forwarders say. It's in verse 17, the second part of the verse. And all shipmasters and seafaring men, sailors, and all whose trade is on the sea, stood far off and cried out as they saw the smoke of her burning. What city was like the great city? And they threw dust on their heads as they wept and mourned, crying out, Alas, Alas for the great city, where all who had ships at sea grew rich by her wealth, for in a single hour she has been laid waste. And so as we look at this song, these songs underline and emphasize for us how readily and how easily mammon does become the idol, does become the priority, the seductress away from, and that which redefines for us what we will call good. And when Jesus says, back in Matthew chapter 6, you cannot serve God and mammon, what he is saying is we will take and idolize and make a priority out of something ahead of God, and this will change and shape how we choose to live, whether we live as citizens of the kingdom or whether we live as people who are citizens of Babylon Mysterion, as people whose great love is for Babylon Mysterion and the seduction to what Babylon Mysterion calls us to. And that is, I think, something that's incredibly important for us to think about and to be people who are, as we live in this world, very thoughtful in our response to, very careful in our response to. Like the kings and the merchants, these who were material enriched by Babylon Mysterion, they're really lamenting their own loss as they look at her. And it's not so much a mourning for her as it is that they're feeling terrible about what this means for them, because they had been making great money off of her. Alas, alas for the great city, where all who had ships at sea grew rich by her wealth. You know, we were the shippers. We were the logisticians. We were the people who were the forwarders. We made a ton of money out of her, and now all of our contracts are gone. And this is useful for us to think of it in these terms. And they lament, and at the same time they keep enough distance to save their own skins. It's as it says here, all whose trade is on the sea stood far off and cried out as they saw the smoke of her burning. So they weep because their contracts no longer exist, and they stay far enough away that it's not going to touch them. And I think of how much of the time in the international order we will see leaders get up and make moral declarations about nations' actions and about their own motives for acting and present themselves as good, and then they flip their values or they ignore their principles for economic reasons. And we see this happen very, very regularly. This is why China has the Belt and Road Initiative, right? I mean, if you know anything about it, China is all over the world operating something called the Belt and Road Initiative, where they're building highways and doing all sorts of things for countries and getting countries deeply into their debt as they develop infrastructure for moving goods and everything else. And they do this not just to facilitate trade, but realizing that typically, because of mammon's seduction, for most humans, morality and ethics are a financial calculus, aren't they? For most humans, morality and ethics are a financial calculus. And the possibility of being tremendously enriched will take someone who might have considered themselves to be morally upright and make them trade their moral uprightness for the bigger bank account. So this is why we need to think seriously about what Jesus' words are when he says in Matthew 6, you cannot serve both God and mammon. Because when the price is right, many people decide that the God that they say they serve is secondary to the God that their hearts actually are inclined toward. And that is something that, you know, and even as I think about one of the most obvious ones that really stuck out in my mind years ago, you know, of course we're Canada, we're upright. You know, we're Canada, we're morally good. We're Canada, we're we're a democracy with the spirit of freedom in a world where there's so many bad things going on. And I still remember years ago, I think it was shortly after Tiananmen Square, that Jean Chrétien led a trade mission that ended up, part of it, the time it was in China. They were all through Southeast Asia, but they were in China. And confronted by the reporters, Jean Chrétien said, "We will not allow human rights to stand in the way of trade." He said it that bluntly. Now you think about that. We're Canada the Good, we think. We will not allow human rights to stand in the way of trade. After a tank has driven over people in Tiananmen Square, after thousands have been shot down, after a media blackout in order to cover up the mass assassination that took place against the student protests. We will not allow human rights to stand in the way of trade. And this is what I mean when I say we have to be very clear on the fact that in so many cases, people will reveal who, what they actually worship when the price is right. And when Chrétien said that, he was just voicing out loud what happens all the time. And this is the spirit of Babylon Mysterion, drunk on the blood of the saints, as is described here in this chapter. And I think as we read this, if Revelation does its work in us, if it does its work in us as we read it, rather than us just looking at it as kind of a novelty and thinking, what's going to happen? What's going to happen? If Revelation does its work in us, it should help us think more clearly about what this world is like. It should help us long for the day when it won't be that way. And it should help us to determine to live the beauty of the redeeming truth of the kingdom here and now. I think that that's what the impact of Revelation should be on us. Help us think more clearly about what this world is like, help us long for the day when it won't be that way, and help us determine to live the beauty of the redeeming truth of the kingdom here and now, so that in some small way we push back against the darkness that so many blindly accept for its material payoff. And I think, yes, Daryl. Mm-hmm. Right. So here's the right. So here's the question that I think that the person putting food on the table has to ask themselves. They have to ask themselves, are we producing a product and doing a job that is actually for the benefit of people, or are we doing something that in some way is exploitative and that is destructive in the lives of people? Like, for instance, I'll give you a straight-on example. Christians in this area have had no problem working in the tobacco industry for decades. Now, you think about that. We have readily worked in an industry that we know kills people. That's a serious thing to think about. Because they wanted to put food on the table. Yeah. Yeah. Employer. You know what? I think that there are going to be corrupt employers, and I think that the scripture talks to us about the fact that we have to have a right response to our employer. I think that one of the things that this is something that we think through very carefully. An employer can be a bad man and produce something that is useful and good inside of the culture. So, but what we're looking at here is people who are willingly participating in the exploitation of and the destruction of others. And this is something for us to actually take and give some thought to. It's an important thing, I think, for us to give thought to things like this. Yep. Probably you have to take and you have to think that through very carefully, because of the fact that as long as Christians are working for people who are not Christians, you will always have sliding scales of that. But I think that the thing that we're seeing more than anything here is the advancement of a system that is essentially exploitative, or a way of living that is essentially exploitative and destructive of people. So it's like if you were selling cars and the owner of the car dealership is not a good guy, but you are selling cars honestly and providing transportation for people with the best of intent, not to be someone who takes advantage of and exploits and is dishonest toward those that you're dealing with. Is there something wrong with that? I don't think so. Right. Ultimately, what happens is you cannot determine that person's lifestyle. But the issue that you have to ask is, are you part of something that is deliberately destructive toward exploitative of people? Are you part of something that is immoral in its very nature? One of the things that we'll see as we come to the end of the chapter here is that there were enjoyable, good, everyday sort of things going on in Babylon Mysterion that will also come to an end. So, okay, so we take a look at this, and as we think about this, we want to be, as it says in Philippians 2, and we want to think about this as we live in the world. We want to be people who are blameless and harmless, the sons of God in the midst of a crooked and perverse generation, among whom we shine as lights in the universe as we hold out the word of life. Now, listen to that. I think that is just a beautiful word that the Apostle Paul speaks as he talks to us about who we're supposed to be. He talks about working out your salvation with fear and trembling, and then he says, living lives so that you are blameless and harmless, the sons of God in the midst of a crooked and perverse generation, among whom you shine as lights in the universe, lights against the black backdrop as you hold out the word of life. And so this is where, when we read this and we see these forwarders and logisticians saying, well, I just carry the product, we come to the fact that we, as people who are followers of Jesus Christ, as we live in this world, as we just, quote, make a living, we have to think about the fact that we want our making a living to be something that is honoring to God, in the fact that it is benevolent and for the good of others, rather than being something that in some way participates in the spirit, the exploitative, corrupting spirit of Babylon Mysterion. The shipmasters here, looking at Babylon Mysterion, don't see evil as they carry goods and are enriched by carrying goods. They don't see evil, they see only the greatness. What city was like the great city, it says in verse 18. And this is because they've developed a perverse value system. And for us as Christians, we have a perverse value system if we say, well, I'm just putting food on the table. Yes, I'm participating in, yes, I'm making money from, I'm being enriched by something that I know is wrong, but I'm not the person who's driving it. I'm not the person who's behind it. I'm just the middleman. I'm just the carrier. I'm just doing some work, and I'm just putting food on the table for my family. We also then have moved into that perverse way of thinking. Because what we've said is that the dollar matters more than doing right. Yes, Sylvia. Mm-hmm. 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 We again, we have to think very carefully about what that means. We don't say, for instance, that profit is essentially evil. But I'll give you a clear example as you talk about the nursing thing in the hospital. So we had a lady here who was part of the church family for years, who was a nurse, who worked in the operating room at St. Thomas Elgin General Hospital. And when St. Thomas Elgin General Hospital began to do abortions, she would not scrub in as a nurse for them. She would be involved in operations that were for the good of people. She would not be involved in operations that involved doing abortions. And that meant that for a while, there was pressure on her. But she looked at it and said, what I will do as I operate inside, as I work inside this system, is I will do good even if there's the threat of job loss. So it's like we think in these terms as we look to live and operate. As Paul says in 1 Corinthians 5, he says, I didn't say to you to separate yourself from the world in terms of coming out of the world. That's how he puts it. But he does call for us to seek to, as we live, deliberately make choices and decisions as kingdom citizens and according to the kingdom, even as we participate in the normal everydays of making a living for our families. So we think about these things, and we want to think about them very carefully. These shipmasters have a perverse value system, and so they mourn their loss, hers but more their own, because she had made them wealthy. Now she was destroyed, and again, what we see in all of this is the totality and speed of her destruction. For in a single hour she's been laid waste. And this, I think, again, is a useful thing for us when we see the speed and totality of destruction, because we so readily put our trust in and think about the permanence of the material and the temporary. And it's a useful thing for us to be brought back again and again to these things that we think, or that in our human short-sightedness we fall into thinking of as being lasting, and that's just the way it is. This is where we have to live. That's just the way it is. That's what we're operating inside of. No, it's not just the way it is. In fact, ultimately, that's not the way that it will be. And the question is, what side are we on? And this is something that we want continually to be thinking about very carefully. How do I be someone who is living on the right side? How do I show that I am a citizen of the New Jerusalem rather than being a citizen of Babylon Mysterion? The bride, the faithful bride, rather than the unfaithful system that offers itself in contrast to the bride. And this is important. We move on next, and the next part of the song that we see is a return to the song from heaven. And as we look at this, before what we saw was heaven singing doom on Babylon and warning to the saints living on the earth. And as that warning comes to the saints living on the earth, as I mentioned before, it's this present, ongoing, moral warning, because the dragon-empowered spirit of economic exploitation, the dragon-empowered spirit of corruption can be seen in any age. Even if there is a final focused Babylon Mysterion, a materially and morally corrupting and seductive final focus, we know that materially and morally corrupting and seductive spirit can run through any age. But now the song that we come to after the song of doom, the song of warning, now the song is a song of celebration. The song from heaven is a song of celebration. Because all who are worshipers of God in his goodness and followers of the Lamb, heaven, the saints, the apostles, and the prophets, joy in the destruction of evil. Rejoice over her, O heaven, and you saints and apostles and prophets, for God has given judgment for you against her. And I think it's a useful thing for us to look and see that this judgment is retributive. That means that this judgment is payback. It's actually payment back for evil done, because Babylon Mysterion had very specifically hated and targeted the New Jerusalem citizens. And as Babylon Mysterion had hated and targeted the New Jerusalem citizens, John's word to believers is Babylon Mysterion will face judgment for the evil that she has done against you. Now, we look at this and we struggle with the reality of our own sin. At least I hope that we do. We struggle with the reality of our own sin, and we come to the cross for grace, and we come to the cross for forgiveness, and so we don't pretend sinlessness. We recognize the reality of our own human hearts, even as we are grateful for the cross, grateful for the work of the cross and the grace of God toward us, so that we have standing with God, so that, as it says in Romans chapter 8, verse 1, there is no longer therefore condemnation for those who are in Christ Jesus. We joy in that. But as we're looking to the goodness of God and the beauty of Christ and the ethic and promise of the kingdom, I think at the same time we ache for the end of evil and the exploitation and life-destroying corruption of evil. And this is something that I think, again, as we come to Revelation and as we see the battle that's taking place here and as we see the judgment of God, I think probably there are times that every single one of us, if we're followers of Jesus, if we love Christ, if we love the goodness of God, and we desire to follow Christ, Are there days when, as you take a look at what's going on in the world, your heart aches? and this is for us as we take a look at what's going on in the world. We understand that God is saying here, the evil, the exploitation, the corruption, the bad things, this will be judged. And that is what motivates this to be a song of rejoicing at this moment. Because what's happened is, finally, after the ache of people who know that they're sinful, who know that it's only the cross of Christ and the grace of God that means that they have the place as sons and daughters, still, as we seek to follow Christ, as we look to Christ in a broken world, as our heart aches, this is what happens when the judgment of God comes. Because now, people whose hearts have been aching as they look at the evil and the exploitation and the terrible things, now they're able to say, it's all been ended. This is the end. God has judged it. God is repaying wickedness and evil. And that's why this stanza is a song of rejoicing. We come to the conclusion then, verse 21, then a mighty angel took up a stone like a great millstone and threw it into the sea, saying, so will Babylon, the great city, be thrown down with violence and will be found no more. And then it says, it lists a whole bunch of things that are actually quite beautiful and pleasant, because these took place inside of Babylon Mysterion. And the sound of harpists and musicians, of flute players and trumpeters will be heard in you no more. And a craftsman of any craft will be found in you no more. And the sound of the mill will be heard in you no more. And the light of a lamp will shine in you no more. And the voice of bridegroom and bride will be heard in you no more. Why? For your merchants were the great ones of the earth, and all nations were deceived by your sorcery. And in her was found the blood of prophets and of saints, and of all who have been slain on the earth. So the mighty angel here that we see in this picture forms a great visionary object lesson for us. And the mighty angel picks up this enormous stone and throws the stone, and the stone sinks rapidly into the sea. And other than the ripples, the stone leaves no trace. And what's being said in this is what the fall of Babylon is going to be like. It's going to happen so immediately that there might be ripples for a moment, but it's going to be gone, sunk out of sight. It's going to be finished entirely and completely. And actually the same message and picture had been given to Jeremiah in chapter 51, verses 63 and 64, when he pronounces God's judgment on ancient Babylon. Comes to the end of the book, the scroll that's representative, that records the judgment on Babylon, and God says to him, now take and tie a stone around it and throw it into the river Euphrates. And that's the picture of the judgment on ancient Babylon. And so ancient Babylon has ceased to exist. What was at the time of Jeremiah speaking the great city in the world, the center of trade in the ancient Near East, this powerful empire. Jeremiah throws the stone in the river with the book attached to it, the words of judgment, and it sinks out of sight. And that is a final object lesson about what would happen to ancient Babylon. Now, for us as believers, we're tricked into believing Babylon Mysterion's claim of permanence. We can be tricked into believing these words that she said back in 18 verse 7. She glorified herself and lived in luxury, so give her a like measure of torment and mourning, since in her heart she says, I sit as a queen. I am no widow, and mourning I shall never see. Declaring her permanence. Declaring the fact that she will always control the world. That trade in the economic system will always be hers. And so it's possible for us as believers to come to this place of exhaustion and despair as we take a look at bad things in the world. But the sinking of the rock is the reminder to us that it's going to happen in a moment and it will be complete. Verses 22 and 23, and with all of this, the normal, everyday pleasantries and comforts and enjoyments that seem to be part of the permanent patterns of undisturbed human existence also go out of existence. Now, here's my question. Do you think as John is speaking these words, as this vision is given to him by God, and we see the sound of music, and we see craftsmen making beautiful things, and we hear the mill at work and providing food, and we see the light of a lamp, and we see the voice of a bride and bridegroom and the voice of a bride, are these things being condemned? Are these things being condemned? No. But what's the result? What's happening? Yes. Right. So they're good things, but the fact is they're inside of something that is a context, a matrix of evil. And as they're inside of a matrix of evil, when evil is destroyed, those good things, those comforts, those enjoyments will be gone too. And I think in some ways, Daryl, that's almost an answer to your question. When you talk about the possibility of working for someone who themselves is committed to doing wrong, good things happen inside of that kind of context. And the person who chooses to do wrong will be judged for it. But the person who is choosing to do good inside of that context, it's not that that is under condemnation. It's the intent of the person who is going to do wrong with what they have as a result of the labors. But so in verse 23 and 24, as we come to the end of it, we see that evil is condemned. The evil that had sustained and underlain these comforts and enjoyments, it ends up being condemned. So what's being condemned here? Well, the merchants who were restlessly driven by the pursuit of wealth and power as their highest priority, as their God, as the foundation for their ethic, they're condemned. The deception and seduction, the sorcery that had caused the nations to accept this as normal and to follow along blindly in evil for pragmatic reasons, for the payoff. Because that's what's going on when it says the nations were deceived by your sorcery. The nations had accepted as normal actions of evil inside of the economic system because of the fact that there's a payoff for them. And as I think about this, I mean, we know some of the stories of great evil done in the name of trade and development. We only know some of them. There's an awful lot more that we don't know. There's so much evil that's done in the name of trade and development, and we have no idea. Many of you know that my brother Steve, when he was in ministry in Peru, was working with Bert Elliott. And Bert Elliott is the older brother of Jim Elliott, and some of you might know the name Jim Elliott as the well-known, the missionary martyr who was killed by the Guarani back in the late 50s in South America. And so yeah, Bert was a very good man as well, and the Lord used him enormously in Peru, and he was Steve's mentor and kind of the grandfather to Steve's grandkids, the adopted grandfather down in Peru. But one of the things, as we hear the story of Jim Elliott and Nate Saint and the various missionaries, the books have told the stories, movies have told the stories. As we hear these stories, one of the things that we often aren't aware of is what the reason is that they went in as fast as they did. This is something that Bert talked with Steve about. So what happened was they went in to try to evangelize the Guarani, the Auca, as quickly as they possibly could because of the fact that Shell Oil was planning to send a mercenary army in to wipe them out. So you think about that, an oil company, a North American oil company, has the plan, because this is a very fierce tribe, they plan to send in a whole bunch of armed mercenaries to wipe this tribe out of existence because it was drilling land that they wanted to get access to. And human souls. This is the reality when we take a look at a lot of what goes on inside of Babylon Mysterion. People are expendable for the sake of the dollar and the shareholders. Yes. Yes. Right. Mm-hmm. Yeah, the trade-off, the payoff, the supposed trade-off and payoff, and people buy it. Buy the lie all the time. Yeah. they're going to lose their education, they're going to lose, yeah. So we can kill these little ones if what it means is that they will enjoy their participation in the economic system more fully. So this is, and it's a sorcery. It's a deception. It's a deception that takes and sucks people in to thinking in ways about the world that are entirely based on an ethic and value system, a morality that is because mammon is God. When mammon is God, then that means that evil is called good. And so we think about this, and the final phrase, and in her was found the blood of prophets and of saints and of all who have been slain on the earth. We think of the ease with which the people of God were killed as the cost of doing business. And then, as it says in conclusion, all who have been slain on the earth. And this is ultimately where the judgment of Babylon Mysterion is rooted. The fact that evil is called good, that human souls are for sale, that all have been slain on the earth, that the blood of saints and prophets is being shed. And so we rejoice when God calls all of this to account and says, finally, it's done. And we're reminded of the fact that even if we are tempted to be secondary participants, oh, I'm just the shipper, I'm just the carrier of goods, I'm just the person who participates in a secondary manner, I'm not actually the evil person myself, I'm just making a living. We're reminded that we can't think in those terms. Not if we're people who actually serve God rather than mammon. Okay, let's pray. Father, we thank you for your goodness to us. We thank you for the life that we have through your Son. We thank you for the kingdom that we are citizens of. And I pray that being kingdom citizens would shape our morality and our ethics and the way that we live in this world. Help us to be people who, when we talk about being pro-life, are truly for life, the abundant life that comes through Jesus Christ, the abundant life that should shape and affect every part of human society and every part of the way that we live and choose to act toward each other and in relation to you. I pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.